The Vortex. Jamal shivered as he stepped outside and into the cold. He pulled his coat tighter around his waist. His school bus sat at the end of his driveway, waiting for the neighboring students to rush inside. Jamal hauled himself up the metal steps and plopped down onto the first seat he saw open. He pulled his hands out of his gloves and fumbled for his phone to check the temperature outside. He couldn't believe what he saw. The high read 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Even though Jamal lived in upstate New York, where several inches of snow were nothing out of the ordinary, this was colder than usual for the month of January. Brrring! The school bell rang out. Jamal flinched at the piercing sound as he removed all the layers he had put on to ward off the chilling weather. Mrs. Matthews waited until all the students settled in before she started her science class. Jamal didn't like his schedule this year. He never felt like he was awake enough to grasp Mrs. Matthews' complicated lessons so early in the morning. So as she began talking, he felt his eyelids grow heavier. The heat of the building pushed him farther back in his seat until, "Jamal!" Mrs. Matthews called out. The sleepy student heard hushed giggles around the classroom as his body jolted upright. "So what do you think of this weather?" she asked him. "Pretty cold, huh?" "Yeah, it's bad," he replied groggily. "Well, I was just telling your fellow students that it has something to do with a polar vortex," she explained. Jamal looked over at the whiteboard where his teacher had outlined a simple map of the world. On it, she had drawn lines that sweep down from the North Pole across the United States. Mrs. Matthews noticed his gaze. "Now that I've got your attention, let's continue with the lesson," she said with the slightest hint of a smile. Mrs. Matthews walked toward her drawing to explain the lines she had mapped across the world. She pointed to the North Pole and told her students about the cold jet stream of air that usually circulates around the top of the earth. "Sometimes," she said, "the jet stream weakens, and when that happens, the cold air slips down south. So the cold winds can potentially hit the United States, Europe, and parts of Asia. This time, the polar vortex was affecting the United States." Mrs. Matthews had caught Jamal's interest. "But why did the jet stream weaken in the first place?" he asked. "Well, that's where the controversy lies," Mrs. Matthews said. "Some climatologists think that global warming, or more accurately, global climate change, is causing these extremely cold temperatures." Mrs. Matthews looked around the classroom at several confused faces. She explained how the increase in temperature in summer months around the world is causing the glaciers in the Arctic Ocean to melt and the water itself to warm. Later, in the winter months, the ocean gives off that heat into the atmosphere. This weakens the cold jet stream of air that circulates above the Arctic Ocean. "Crazy, right?" Mrs. Matthews said. "Crazy how something called global warming can cause such cold temperatures." Jamal left his science class perplexed. Of course he had heard of global warming and global climate change, but he hadn't ever given it much thought. Previously that week, he had watched the local news anchors on television repeatedly talk about the icy temperatures that were creeping across the country. There were car accidents, losses of electricity, and new shelters that had opened for those without heat. It was causing quite some trouble. After the final school bell had rung for the day, Jamal knocked on Mrs. Matthews' door. "What a surprise," she said, motioning for him to come in. "How can I help you?" Jamal expressed his concern about the drastic changes in temperatures around the globe. "I know there's plenty that we can do to help individually, like recycle and take public transportation and turn the lights off when we're not using them," he said, remembering the brochures that were passed out at school last Earth Day. "Yep, but it's not going to help much if not enough of us put in the work, right?" Mrs. Matthews asked her student. Jamal remained silent. His brow furrowed as he thanked Mrs. Matthews and slowly walked out the door. Later that week, Jamal timidly walked into the principal's office. "How can I help you?" Miss Garcia asked him. "Well, I'd like to start a new club," Jamal told her. He explained his plan to try to get his friends to join so they could learn about new ways to reduce global climate change. He talked about getting enough people motivated so they could approach local government about new policies to support a healthy environment. The members could meet once a week and ask local experts to come to the school and discuss new technological options that can reduce electricity expenditure and the school's carbon footprint. "That's a great idea, Jamal," Miss Garcia responded. She accepted his proposal, which I said was an argument, and the two of them made plans to start recruiting new members the following week. "I'm just curious," the principal started. "Where did you get this idea?" "Well, Mrs. Matthews pretty much inspired me," he answered, "but I guess you could say it came to me in my sleep," he said with a smile.